And thank you to Ben and Seema for inviting me. It's a real honor and quite nerve-wracking to be here. Especially as you'll see, I think what I wanted to do in this talk is something slightly different, which is to try to persuade many of you in this room that this is an area where a lot of papers that have been written in different areas and thinking about political economy, about institutional design, start to be very applicable in perhaps addressing one of the most important challenges many of us think the world faces today in terms of how do we actually reduce carbon emissions. And so really the nature of the talk is less about here are a set of findings, but more about here are a set of papers that perhaps are informative of some of the challenges facing the institutions, some of the institutions for carbon regulation. And I think it's a broad, open research agenda that hopefully many people will find interesting. So as we know, I think the big elephant in the room was really set up front by the Paris Agreement on the basis of a lot of scientific evidence that if we want to limit global warming, a reasonable target is that by 2050, you try to reach net zero, which is that as much carbon is emitted into the atmosphere is taken out. And importantly, this is a target at the global level. Since then, we've seen countries, companies, individuals set for themselves net zero targets. One of the more important things is that to date, we have no rules that try to understand how these net zero targets, which may be at a national level, will add up to a global net zero target. And so I think many of us are used to seeing on newspapers or Twitter and so on, pictures like this, which would remind you that the top line or the blue shaded area is that on the basis of the current net zero targets or the policies that we have, what is going to be the trajectory of the decline in carbon emissions, while the green dotted line is perhaps the most conservative estimate that many believe is no longer attainable of 1.5 degrees centigrade. But certainly, I think something like 2 degrees you would hope would be feasible. However, if you look at just right now where we are relative to, say, a closer target of 2030, we are off by quite a lot. Now, when we start thinking about how to move towards these targets, there's been a lot of discussion, and Rachel and Seema have a very nice recent paper in the JEP making this point, that in a lot of cases, if we have limited funds in particular, the social returns of targeting emissions in lower income countries is particularly high. So the starting point, of course, it doesn't matter where you reduce emissions. A ton of greenhouse gas emissions is going to expand the levels irrespective of source. And so what this means is that for any funding source, what you want to do is you want to reduce the cheapest to reduce emissions first, because it's going to have a cumulative effect. And hopefully over time, perhaps technology will make the more expensive to reduce emissions cheaper to remove. And so, as I said, sort of Seema and Rachel lay out a series of arguments in favor of this, and highlighting factors such as when you think about, say, land use projects where you're trying to keep forests in place, land is cheaper, labor is cheaper. And also a lot of these places haven't built out their grid right now, so it's possible to potentially build green at a lower cost. However, the force going in the other direction is, of course, that of economic growth. And this is something that was even recognized in the Paris Agreement, which is that if you're going to achieve net zero, you're going to need to give potentially a different path for lower income countries because they have growth needs. And in this year's AEA Distinguished Lecture, these two graphs are from Michael Greenstone's lecture. What you see, what is true is that essentially there's a linear relationship between development and energy use. And so you can see India, China, US, three of the larger emitters are just at different points on this. And while renewables have become much cheaper, given the status of the grid and given where energy is being procured for, much of the evidence suggests that we are going to continue to see a larger use of fossil fuels. I think you can imagine there is some uncertainty here. We may discover how to store renewables very fast. The grid might become much cheaper to change. But as of now, the prediction is that just the demands of growth are going to move it in that direction. So the first option you might ask is, let's just look at what's happening. And can we just scale up domestic policies? Largely, they're happening in rich countries, but certainly we see more action in this in countries like China and India. So what is the current status? Today, the domestic carbon pricing policies cover roughly a quarter of emissions. Carbon taxes are not that high. They're roughly 6%. And carbon compliance markets, which is one thing I'll talk about a little bit more, are large and growing. And certainly, China has been experimenting with pilot emission markets in carbon. India has put forward a plan for it. And so there is some hope that this will expand. But it's still likely to leave out some of the sectors, especially like the land use sector, which is an important source of emissions. And importantly, one thing that these policies do is they fail to largely leverage what I talked about in the last slide, the fact that there are gains from trade if we can get climate financing to go from rich to poor countries. So what do we see when we try to look at cross-border trades? So I think right now the larger policy, and one that gets a lot of discussion, is really a policy that started as a way of trying to prevent leakage. So this was a concern that as you have domestic, say, carbon consumption taxes in EU, you're worried that there'll just be leakage where a set of African or Asian countries will start using fossil fuel intensive technologies to produce those goods. And so therefore, there's been a push towards putting taxes on imports into these countries which are fossil fuel intensive. The second one, which I'm going to spend quite a lot of time talking about, and is right now a very small market, is to try to think about voluntary carbon offsets in the voluntary carbon market that go from poor to rich countries. And so this is the idea that you're trying to allow individuals to meet these targets by financing lower cost emissions in low-income countries. So if we just look across these two, you may ask, why might we prefer one over the other? So first, there's a strong equity argument. I think there's a reasonable literature pointing out that one of the costs of cross-border adjustment taxes is that they are not providing any subsidies to low-income countries to transition to clean production. So they're going to possibly not be able to sell aluminum to EU, but they're not actually being provided with the resources to invest in green technologies. And so this arguably goes completely counter to climate justice, which we want to lie at the center of this. There's also a strong argument for efficiency that was made in a very nice paper, theory paper by Bard Hustad, who made the point that if prior to allowing for domestic consumption production, we allow for what he called deposit trade. So think of deposits as just a physical area that contains fossil fuels. So the model he considers is a coalition of rich countries. They recognize that they just put consumption taxes, there'll be leakage, other countries increase. So he says, before you put any of these taxes, allow the countries to just engage in trade of deposits. And in fact, he directly links it to forest conservation projects. What this will do, it will make the selling countries' supply curve more inelastic. And so the coalition of buying countries can then reduce their supply, and he shows a set of conditions under which it actually prevents leakage. What this implies is, in a world where we don't have international emission rights, and so quotient bargaining breaks down ex post, you can actually show that you can recover under a certain set of conditions efficiency by having ex ante trading. Now, what's important about this argument, and in some sense what fails in the world, is asymmetric information. This completely assumes that once you bought the deposit, you can completely control what happens to it, and you know what that deposit contains. As we'll see, much of the concerns we have in this literature are problems to the fact that I don't know what the deposit has, and I also don't know what happens after I buy it. And then, of course, the final argument for trading is that it's perhaps the best use of limited climate financing. So before I jump into the rest of the talk, let me just briefly talk about some very brief terminology. So carbon offsets, this is the word that we use for to compensate a business if you invest in, let's say, a green project that eliminates emissions. Now, what this is, it's a token that's created when you finance a project, and it allows you to say, I have offset my emissions. This is distinct from, and this is what is traded in a voluntary carbon market. So there is supposed to be a mechanism under, again, Paris Agreement Article 6.4, but it's not been agreed upon in multiple COPs. So the main mechanism is that this is what is traded in the voluntary carbon markets. In contrast, and I think people often talk about this separately, but kind of switch these terms around, but I'm going to try to keep it separate, are carbon credits. So carbon credit is a measurement unit to cap emissions. So this is going to be a metric ton of CO2e that you're allowed to emit in a market where you face a cap on your total emissions. So the difference, I think, between these two markets is that in a voluntary market, there's no binding constraint of any kind. And so there is no way that what you're doing is adding up to any ceiling, while that is a defining feature of a compliance market. So given that, what am I going to talk about today? I'm going to spend my time really talking about what we can learn from, I think, a lot of development economics and environmental economics papers about how to reform VCM. Let me put up front, this is a very small market right now. It's a market that we've all probably seen thinking about how to offset our flights, but it's a very small market. In 2021, which was the peak of the market, just around 0.2% of global emissions were reduced by it. However, if it can work, I think it has very significant potential. So just to give you an example, land use change, primarily deforestation, contributes between 12 to 20% of annual GHG emissions. And this is one of the primary sectors that that this market can help doing. I also want to argue, and that's going to be kind of an ongoing theme through it, that identifying reforms to this market are very well suited, I think, to the toolkit of the kind of research many of us have been doing in this area. We've been thinking about institutional design, but importantly, we've also been thinking about policy implementation. And I think a lot of the issues that this market is facing is really thinking about implementation related issues when you have incomplete information. So the talk's I'll probably be talking faster as you go along, but this is what I want to do. I want to talk about what the current status is and what I think the kind of agency problems and price problems in this market are. I want to talk about sort of three related challenges that I think we can start trying to address using research that exists. But then there are probably many more open questions, and I want to end with those. So I think we've all seen graphs like this, and let me just highlight the one in the corner because, certainly I was thinking about it when I flew here from London, which was roughly a 10-hour flight. And what's striking about it, of course, is how cheap it is right now to offset your price, right? So for $31, I could have offset the emission cost of my flight. So what underlies this? So when we talk about this market and we say, I can offset it, what's going on? So there are four sets of players we have in this market. So the first is the buyer. So that could be someone like me, but it could also very often is increasingly large companies. And when we talk about whether there's potential for the market, it's because a lot of these companies are now facing significant shareholder pressure to show that they're reaching net zero on their own. The second group, which is on the flip side, is the sellers or the developers. So these are project developers who are going to propose to, for instance, preserve ecosystems to reduce these emissions. And of particular interest, I think, for this group are the REDD+ projects, which make up a large share of this market right now. But how do these projects go from, say, someone developing a project in Namibia to someone wanting to buy it in the US? So you have a set of brokers. I think South Pole is one of the better known ones, where they are the ones who are in charge of identifying these projects, putting them together. And largely what happens in this market right now is over the counter trades. So you have OTC exchanges that occur between buyers and brokers directly. It's fine. And then finally, this is an unregulated market. So there's no government setting rules. So what you have instead is you have registries, and these are registries that are supposed to verify that these carbon offsets exist, but also importantly, make sure they don't get traded multiple times, right? So once it's traded, you don't want to trade it again. And that's one of the things that's supposed to do, avoid double counting and facilitate exchange. So as I said, this market is small, but I think what was striking was what we've seen towards the end of it. So if you look at articles in around 2020, 2021, there was a lot of discussion that, by 2030, this will be 20 billion. And, especially for the land use sector, this is going to be one of the huge ways that we're going to see progress being made. So if you might ask, well, if I look in 2021, who were the kind of players in this market, and was it actually in any way a source of climate finance for low-income countries? So this is from Carbon Beef that looked at offset purchases by the world's top 50 companies that had net zero targets by market capitalization. So you see that 75% of the offsets were bought in rich countries by the groups you'd want to buy. So these are fossil fuel companies and car manufacturers. And then if you look at who was selling it, it was actually coming from lower income countries. So the three largest offset providers were projects in Indonesia, China, and Colombia. If you ask which was the single largest offset project in this group, it was Indonesia's peatland project, which was equivalent to taking 2 million cars off the road. And roughly half of this market was coming from these REDD+ forest protection projects. But what happened in 2022 was a steady decline followed by a big crash in early 23. So this just shows you for different types of projects. So the dark blue line is nature-based projects. The light blue is household devices and cook stoves. You see that in 2022, which was sort of at the peak, the trading was at around $15 for 1 metric ton, and today it's basically between $1 to $4. There were two factors. There was certainly some stagnation, but there was a significant increase. There was a set of influential research in 23 that really led to the crash. So before I do that, what was associated with the crash? So again, just another piece of terminology. There was revelations of widespread non-additionality in this market. So it's important to recognize that a project is additional if the emissions that are reduced by the project would not have occurred without the money. So if you have a piece of land on which there are trees and you're not going to keep those trees irrespective of whether you not get money, that's non-additional. In January 2023, a set of newspapers put together an article reporting that on the basis of the investigation, 90% of rainforest offset projects that had top-tier verification from either registries or brokers did not achieve additionality. And then in August 23, there was a very influential, and I'll come back to it briefly, article in Science that stated similar effects. It wasn't zero, but it was very overstated. And what's important to remember, this is non-additionality is worse than sort of a misallocated subsidy in some ways. Because when you have a misallocated subsidy, it's going to the wrong person. But here what the person is doing is they're increasing their emissions, or they're not changing their emissions on the basis of the fact that they believe they have offset. So if you have a sale of a lot of non-additional carbon projects, you're potentially increasing total emissions in the atmosphere because people are adjusting their activity against it. And then the second thing that we certainly see by now is, this is just showing you what's happening to these prices. February 23, they were still around $10. Now they're around 1 to 4. And so if you even by any metric, forget about the cost. I mean, I put true in quotes because I think understanding the true cost is an open research question in this area. But just to give you a sense of the difference, the social cost of carbon, the EPA currently values at $190 per ton. In this market, for the same 1 metric of CO2 emissions, which is what we care about, you can buy it for between $1 to $5, which is why I think we can think that we're doing a great job by buying offsets for our flights. So what are the three problems, or the multiple problems that have come out? And after this, I'll come to what we can learn from economics research on this. So first is adverse selection. It's clear that if I have a project that's non-additional, it costs me no money to not emit. And therefore, I have a lot of incentives to enter. So this is a market that has marked by adverse selection. Given this adverse selection, you might ask, well, why isn't screening working better? Why isn't it coming out? Well, that part of the market is got a lot of moral hazard. So it's largely based on ex-ante verification in this market. And so what tends to happen is that project developers are calculating their own emission savings. And then either registries or brokers or developers are going to pay the auditors to check the measurement. All of these groups are getting revenue from selling offsets and have a lot of value from just increasing sales. So there's a clear conflict of interest. You might think this might be reduced and you form a reputation if ex post the projects you verified turn out to be bad. However, first of all, it's very hard as a buyer to know whether or not your project is reducing emissions. I mean, you look up in the sky, what can you tell? So it's not like buying a car. But also, there's very weak incentives for project monitoring. Rich country buyers can't directly oversee. And often, the host country and the implementing body are going to face incentives to continue economically relevant activities, like, for instance, deforestation, even after having sold the project. So that's, I think, the set of problems that we have to think about how to fix in this market. Other than this, there's, I think, a second issue, and that's the one I'm going to start with, which is a market design problem. So right now, the way the market works is you have a lot of decentralized over-the-counter trades between brokers, And brokers and buyers don't actually have to report in their prices on any regular basis. And even if they do, you don't know how much of it is a commission to a broker, how much is going to the project developer. So price discovery is essentially broken in this market. So what we end up seeing is we see just low prices with wide margins. And then the second thing is, which makes the market hard to work, is that we have, unlike a compliance market, we have no predictable demand because we have no mandate on offset purchase. So you might ask, that's fine, there's a lot of problems, let's just focus on what works, and I think many people would say that let's focus as economists on getting compliance markets everywhere, carbon pricing. I think we need to give VCMs a chance, but it needs a lot of work. There's clearly a lot of interest from good buyers right now. It's one of the few viable sources of climate financing in the global South. As recently as this year, some of the largest kind of emitters have sought to create a coalition, but the way right now they're working is largely principles. So the US Treasury announced a set of principles in May. ICBCM is the main regulator right now. None of us would disagree with the principles. They're all very good principles. But we know that principles are not enough, and that's where we come in, right? So I think what I want to talk about is I think some guidance that we have from papers on how should we restructure the markets. How do we ensure that actually the carbon pricing accounts for the scarcity of the remaining emission space? That's one thing that is not happening right now in this market. And then, what rules should guide the measurements so that they get slightly more additional, and who should verify, and what monitoring mechanism will be in place? And as I predicted, I'll go faster through this, but I think many of these are papers you've seen in some form before. And I should say, to the extent it draws on my work, I have many collaborators to thank for this. So let me start by just restructuring the market. So I think it's important to recognize that offsets as they're designed right now will not hit climate targets, nor will they achieve climate justice. But I want to argue that if we can get them to be redesigned as carbon credits, they might. So, what is offsetting doing? Offsetting allows me to offset my emissions. So if I'm a rich country emitter, I can buy out my emissions. But to reach a global target, I potentially, in the end, will also have to reduce my own emissions, right? And I think there is no mechanism in offsetting to account for the fact that in the end, we need to be net zero at a global level. And then, of course, we need to kind of have a pricing mechanism that's going to account for the fact that to the extent that it's cheaper to reduce emissions, it doesn't mean that kind of low-cost providers should get the lowest price feasible. Climate justice means that they need to be funded for the development path that they need to take instead. So what was the promise if we can make it work? So this just shows you the difference between the price currently for EU ETS, which is $60 per ton, and international carbon credits, which I mentioned is basically between $1 and $5. And so if you can get a compliance market that includes carbon offsets to work, you can potentially improve price setting and reduce emissions. Now, this is not fully a pie in the sky. There's one example of this has happened, which is the Chicago Carbon Exchange that functioned between 2003 and 2010. It set baseline emissions and which were binding if you entered the market and you got allowances to match these targets. Offsets produced by third parties could be traded, and they were, the members of you would see in this groups you'd recognize: Ford, DuPont, cities entered, and universities entered. But what we find is that basically in the end, the prices collapsed. They had not solved the quality problem. And also with the collapse of the US cap and trade legislation, there was no predictable demand, and this shut down in 2010. So I think it's a good example to say you can set up the infrastructure for it, but you still need to figure out a way of providing high quality credits. Now, in some ways, I think what I'm trying to say we want to move towards is a bit more ambitious. It's actually a global compliance market. We want low-income countries ideally to participate in these markets and provide carbon credit. Now, you may say this is not going to be feasible. There's some basic assumptions we need for a compliance market that we might worry about will not work in low state capacity settings, which is, for instance, how do we monitor these emissions, and a regulator credibility to ensure that those who are polluters that enter from these places have sufficient permits. Let us briefly talk about some work that I've been doing over a very long period of time with Michael, Nick, and Anant, which shows that you can actually have pollution markets that work in lower income settings. So we've been working since well before 2010 in Western India, in a city of Surat, which is one of India's fastest growing cities. And it has a lot of textile mills which are very polluting. So this is a market for particulate emissions. And we managed to work with the regulator to set up a system to experimentally evaluate it. The feature I think that this evaluation shares with some of what I'm discussing is that we really had to start from scratch. We started by providing a white paper in 2010, and then Anant, who also has an engineering background, was in the committee that set up the monitoring infrastructure. We had to pass the national mandate. The government had to pass the national mandate and get approval for it. But what this is this just shows you now the main findings from the study, which is once the market started, and it was in a mock period till July or August 2019. And what you see, I think the first thing you see is not something you expect to see in these markets, which is a difference in compliance. So we typically think because the control plants remained in command and control, if there was good regulatory compliance, everyone should have been complying. And what cap and trade system does, it gives you more flexibility in reaching that ability. But in low state capacity settings, an important finding we have is that actually the market mechanism, because it incentivizes buyers and sellers well, and because the regulator is able to penalize, it can actually improve compliance. So in terms of what we find, we find almost perfect compliance. The market has now been expanded to a second city. There's active trading at a single market clearing price, and there is, importantly, evidence of gains from trade. We found a decline in emissions, and we also were able to then use the fact that we had the full set of permit bids to estimate marginal abatement costs. And we find that consistent with, for instance, evidence on EU ETS, it's not very expensive to abate in this environment. So the kind of questions you may ask at this point is, the first is, well, I think I'll say the first one is an open question. If you set up such a market, would you have enough demand? Because it's going to be a voluntary market. There have recently been increases. So Japan is the most recent example that has started such a market. It has 40% of national emissions covered by it. Certainly in the background, I think there is a sense that if the voluntary market doesn't work, the government will come in and make it mandated. But I think what we see from the Surat study suggests that if you can get sufficient demand and a credible regulator, markets will strengthen compliance and therefore further demand. So the second question I want to now turn to is, of course, the second part we need for such a market to work is whether we can resolve the supply of credit issue. And then finally, and that's really going to be the set, I think, open questions I'm going to leave you with, what are the set of market rules that we need to work on to get such a global market to work? So I think many of you have probably seen about additionality this year, given the job market paper by Anna Russo this year. And this was a paper that demonstrated that it looked at a particular program, the US Conservation Reserve Program, and where projects bid to be able to get resources in order to not cultivate the land and instead preserve it. What they showed is, using a regression discontinuity between those who just won and who just lost the bid, that most of the land was non-additional, that most of the people who got the money in the system were not additional. But she also shows clear evidence that there is adverse selection in this market. And the way she shows it, which is what you see in this graph, is that she's able to estimate for every project developer what was the share that would have been cropped in the absence of the contract. And what you find is the lowest additionality, or the lowest share, being cropped among those who put forward the lowest bids, which makes sense because you have no cost at all. A different and very nice, I think, point is made in a recent working paper by Daniel, Nick, and their co-author, where they look at CDM projects in China, and they basically look at the dynamic effects. And here what they show is, as you put in place clean investments, of course, that has the effect of reducing emissions, and that's the point of CDM. But now actually it's kind of potentially productivity enhancing to expand production, right? Because you now have access to potentially better inputs. And so what they find is that over time, these projects that benefited from CDM, there's certainly some adverse selection, but importantly, there's also just the direct effect of investment increasing emissions, all these firms. So given that you can have non-additionality, you may ask, why is non-additional projects not screened out? And I think I talked a bit about this, but let me talk now specifically about the paper that came out in Science in 2023. So this is a paper that took a set of 27 projects that had been verified in 6 countries. And again, I think the industry standard at this point is what we would call engineering estimates. So you simply get kind of baseline estimates based on some kind of engineering idea of what we think the trend would be in the absence of the project. And typically the trend is just a projection of the current status, and very often includes actually the project site itself. So instead, what this project did is this was a few years after these projects had happened. So it identified comparable control areas and then used synthetic control methods to ask what was the actual deforestation. And what they find is that only 7% was additional. And they identified 2 main problems. The first is, and I think I mentioned this already, which is the measurement is prone to manipulation. There's a lot of flexibility and it's used to maximize sales. But the second one, I think, which has been underestimated, and I think is very familiar to everyone in this room, is that you have a bunch of implementation issues. A project gets assigned, the money doesn't arrive in time, money doesn't get to the farmers in time. There's just all kinds of host of issues and implementation along the way that are just going to mean that you're not going to get additionality the same way, especially in low-income settings. So again, I think this is a point where you could give up, or you could say, is there anything we know from the literature on whether there is additionality ever? And if there is, that will help inform us on what we should be doing in this market. So, Seema has been writing many papers in this area, and Kelsey and others. And so let me just briefly talk about a couple of papers that you probably know a bit of. So the first is from an experimental evaluation of a PS project in Uganda, just asking, can you get additionality? And importantly, what you can also look at is there any evidence of leakage? So is it the fact that when you reduce in one area, deforestation in one area, it just moves to another? So, what they find is there is evidence of additionality. And I think what you can take away from this paper is 2 things. First is you learn something about the type of pricing that would work, right? So if you have at that point in time 70,000 Ugandan shillings, that was sufficient incentive to move some set of people to not deforest, and they find no evidence of leakage. The second paper that I wrote with Seema, Namrata, and Kelsey asks a question which is perhaps relevant for implementation, which is that in standard PS, you're going to offer, it's a conditional payment. It's payment that's conditional on having evidence that you complied in some way, undertook some specified pro-environmental behavior. But the kind of implementation challenges that we are likely to see in low-income countries is first is credit constraints. And so you can imagine a PS project gets paid out in the market, but then, and this is something that in the CDM market is well documented, money does not arrive to the CDM developer. It takes a very long time to get there. And as a result, there may also just be mistrust in this environment. So what we're interested is, can you actually get more additionality by something that you would never do in a first best world, which is to give part of the payment upfront? So obviously, if you give part of the payment upfront, you reduce individual incentives to comply because the amount you're going to get exposed as later is smaller. But if the concern is either you don't have liquidity or you lack trust, this might actually be a useful thing to do. And what we did is this experiment we ran was actually to reduce burning of crop residue, which is a large problem for air pollution in North India. There's also some claim that this matters for greenhouse gas emissions because of black carbon being released, for instance. But I think the main thing we found is that the standard PS contract had no additionality. So this is using satellite image data to show you how much land was unburnt. And so compared to the control, the standard PS did not have increased any additionality. The bar on the left, which is upfront PS, showed significant increase in additionality. And so you found that in this particular setting, these market imperfections seem to matter. And the one that we found more evidence in favor of was trust, that giving people payment upfront made them believe more that money will arrive afterwards as well. So as I said, a lot of this is just trying to start an agenda rather than saying what you do. But I think 2 things you can imagine doing. First is trying to create a sandbox for evaluations to identify features that should enter project category additionality. These could be a whole set of studies. These could be experiments. These could be RD studies. These could also be, now people are very interested in thinking about how to use AI and prediction models to establish program standards that guide additionality calculations. So just to return to SEMA study, you could say, well, if you're going to propose a project in Uganda where you're paying farmers less than 70,000, that's less likely to succeed. So you may have some minimum requirements, for instance, on payments. You can also, if to the extent you're going to continue working with these engineering estimates, I think one thing we've seen happen is that you can use evaluations to inform the parameters. One important parameter is program take-up. I think in many PS schemes, we see take-up is well, and I think this is true of many social protection other programs that people in this room work on, is that take-up is well below what we actually believe is, real world take-up is below what is often put into models. And so I think that's another place where you can actually use this to guide. But I think mostly I would say this is a room in which not just economists, but I think applied people are not sitting. So if you see, for instance, the whole to and fro that happened around the study in the science, it was a very different conversation than I think where we would be having as applied microeconomists. And I think there's a lot of value for us to be informing those discussions by at least what we think of as credible standards. And this is, as I said, there is a lot of push right now to be implementing these principles. So I think it's a good time to be thinking about this. Okay, so let me turn to the second thing, which is how do we possibly align incentives and screen out low quality projects? So as I said, sort of that, I think when you think about how moral hazard and low state capacity are impacting the three sets of people involved, all of whom are possibly got agency constraints. So you have the baseline verifiers, and these are typically paid by project developers. And there's a lot of concern of inflated baselines. Importantly, it's also the case that the project selectors, and these can often be, say, national governments, in the case of CDMs or individuals, will often have, and I'll show you an example, multiple objectives, some of which are not compatible with maximizing additionality. And then finally, project developers, once they've sold their project, they suddenly don't have any incentives to maintain standards. And so if we don't have ex post monitoring, you're likely to fail. And right now, ex post monitoring is very limited. So let me start with an example to give you from CDMs, which I like a lot, which is, I think, a classic example of what may happen. So this is a paper by Callel, Colmer, and others looking at wind farm projects in India. So the graph shows you basically the new stalled wind park capacity over time. And you can see that after the Kyoto Protocol and CDMs came in place, there was a large increase in wind farm capacity. What he does is he basically identifies 476 projects, and I think makes a very simple, if you want, reveal preference argument to say that in the same state year, if there's another project that is built without subsidy, that is an area that is less windy, further from the grid, and smaller, then the project that was funded by the CDM is less likely to be additional, because the other project was clearly less profitable, was actually built by a private sector developer. And then I think the part that I find very interesting is he tries to think about why did these projects actually get approved. So the first thing he notes is that the first set approver in the CDM system is what they call a designated national authority, the Indian government. The Indian government is also trying to maximize its contributions to sustainable development goals, which is just maximizing wind power. And so therefore, what they want from that perspective is they want to just put in place large wind projects, not necessarily additional wind projects. So you say, okay, that's the first step, but there are other safeguards. Well, the verification of additionality is paid for by the project developer, and pretty much every project that makes it past the Indian government gets approved. And then finally, you might say, well, what about the CDM? What about the heft of the international board? Well, it's 10 people, and at the peak of this, these 10 people were approving 15 projects a day. So, it's just clearly they're not going to have that capacity to do it. So let me talk about now, I think, two ways in which one can imagine reforms in a private sector verification system, which is likely to come. So one which was actually preceded our work on markets in Gujarat was we started working with them on audit conflict. This was I think the only time in my life this happened that someone entered my office and said, I believe you work on policy design. I'm a lawyer and I have a problem in the court. I'm working in India. So the regulator in Gujarat had been taken to court by firms saying that we don't want to pay for the audit scheme because the data is never used. And the Regulators said, we don't use the data because it's corrupted. And then, so the court had said, you have to, within a certain amount of time, offer a reform that is kind of evidence-based. Otherwise, we will remove the scheme. So that was also a reason why they were willing to participate in a large-scale experiment. And so the first thing we did was, well, this shows you from the control group, they have a third-party audit system where you actually get, you submit pollution reports. So for the top slide shows you, the top graph shows you the distribution in the audit report submitted in the control. And as you can see, there's very large bundling just under the regulatory standard. This is the reason why the board didn't believe it. The second is data that we did by just conducting back checks in the control group around the same time. So what you see now is a much bigger distribution. So I think what I find striking is not only do you see a lot of, let's say, polluters who were being put under the standard, but importantly, there were a lot of good people who also were being put just under the standard. And so overall, what was happening was, the market had just completely collapsed. Everyone was just ticking a box that you were at around 150. So what we did is we worked with them to reform the scheme by saying that rather than having the payment come from the firms pay into a central pool, and then they're assigned auditors who are on some centralized list. So when we did that for 2 years, this is from the treatment, there's still a little bit of stacking. So it's not like it completely goes away, but it's much less. And importantly, you can see the whole distribution, which also opens up, for instance, for the regulator, more tools, right? They can imagine about, for instance, how they can actually not just use sticks on bad people, but also kind of provide rewards to those who are under it. But what was one question we were often asked, even in this process, is, well, who will audit the auditors? How do you know if you have the system that over time this itself will not get somewhat corrupted? And I think here in this general literature, what we're seeing is just a lot of promise coming from satellite-based monitoring, especially for land use projects. But again, it's something that has not been taken up yet in the overall sector of thinking about how to implement it in the context of carbon offset project. But a nice paper, which comes from Brazil, looks at what was implemented in the Brazilian Amazon system. Is a system called DITTER, which is a satellite-based surveillance system for deforestation activity. So what it would do is, and you can see 2 examples from the same piece of land, is that it would over time simply look at the same land. So the top one tells you when there is forest cover. The lower one tells you that this forest cover has been removed. And so when it automates the system so that when you see this kind of change, the regulator is told this, and then they can send out an inspection team. And what they found that the increased monitoring and law enforcement that followed by this reduced municipal deforestation in the Amazon by 25%. But again, I think this one, different projects may not all be conducive for satellite-based imagery, but there's certainly a large set of projects that can, but this is not in place yet. So again, so now if you start thinking about how do we start improving quality again, so what would be some kind of credible verification system? I think the one that seems to me very straightforward to do is we have bodies now like ICBCM and others. They should be creating a list of certified verifiers, and a project developers or brokers should be applying for a verifier from this pool and paying into the registry. These verifiers should have some gains from building a reputation across countries and projects when they come from the centralized pool. And I think that could be worked on. So that seems to be something that perhaps if you can take traction with the groups that are right now trying to think about how to implement guidelines, you could make some headway. The second that's interesting, I think, especially for land use, is if you ask right now, what is the gold standard of any kind of standardized monitoring technology in this way? Pretty much all carbon content data is proprietary. It's a large private sector activity. There are a few nonprofits now like GeoTrees and C-Trees that are trying to generate this global data, but really not at scale yet. So I think what we need to do is we need to move towards a system where you're going to scale up a single universal standard by which you're going to measure this kind of carbon storage cover and make that available so that that's what's used for monitoring in all places. And that would, I think, add a lot of credibility to what we see as a quality standard. And I think there's certainly, again, some movements in this area, but it's largely quite small and by nonprofits. So let me now talk about all the questions that I don't have answers to. So, what are we going to need if we really want to take seriously this idea of how to redesign a VCM to reach these global greenhouse gas targets while being serious about climate targets? So I think, one of the big elephants in the room is, will you get enough demand? Like, if you have this kind of voluntary market, why will people come in? I think we are seeing a lot of, especially shareholder activism towards large companies. That's really what's driving a lot of activity in this market right now. So there's certainly something to build on, even though I think you'll have to kind of try it out to know whether there is enough in it. I think I've talked about three things that we're going to need. You're going to need a single set of quality rules for the credit providers. I think in deforestation or in forest, I think I can see how one can get there. Other sectors may be harder. So for instance, for Corsia or for cook stoves, we'll have to think a bit more about it. I think it's very important to ensure that you're conservative. So you're going to take a measure of credit that is conservatively going to have a certain reduction. I think the market regulations are going to need to put in place some kind of, once you agree to enter this market, you're going to face a cap. And you're going to need to have that designed in a way so that the emission reduction obligations are sensitive to country income or host country income. And then, of course, finally, you have to agree on the rate to which reduce this over time. I think in most successful compliance markets, you don't start by where you want to get to. You don't start with the 2050 target. You start with something that gets enough demand in. And then over time, as people start learning how to improve things, you go to that. So I'm going to end with two sets of open research questions. I think there's a set of open research questions around measurement. It's clear that going to set high standards for developers is necessary, but it's costly. So, what's the kind of ratio we want to have for cost of verification to cost of credit? And how do you do this in a way that you still manage to maintain project viability in low-income settings? I think price discovery in this market has not occurred. It's clear there's quite a lot of uncertainty. When you talk to people in financial markets, they'll talk a little bit, for instance, about the kind of stress testing that is done, to look at what would happen if there's a global crisis. And I think it could be possible that one can try to use those kind of financial economics tools to try to think about how do you actually try to have some kind of predictability that you're going to need to set prices. And then I think, there's just a set of questions on market design. We have, I think, a fantastic set of colleagues more broadly in the profession working on market design, but there's actually been less attention paid to the market design of climate markets. So these are just some of the questions that I think we need to ask to get at it. But, to make it not seem impossible, let me just say that I think underlying this, the more I've sort of read and work in this area, I think it's a set of themes that I feel we see all the time. We need to think about participant incentives and we think about institutional structures. And I think just looking around the room, I'd say the majority have thought about this. So I think this is hopefully an area that we could, if we wanted to make some progress on. Thank you very much.